I never imagined the day would come when my own son would decide I did not belong in his world. One moment, I was a mother who had given everything, and the next, I was a woman quietly erased, barred from a celebration that marked his success. What hurt was not the rejection alone, but the realization that my silence over the years had helped build the man who could do this to me. That night, standing outside while the door stayed closed, I understood something irreversible had already broken, and one small gift was about to change everything. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Margaret Lawson, and I am 62 years old. When people look at me now, they usually see a quiet woman with gray beginning to overtake her brown hair, someone who moves carefully and speaks only when necessary. What they do not see are the decades behind me, the years that shaped every choice I made, especially the ones that led me to become the kind of mother I was. This story is not about a single night or a single mistake. It is about a lifetime of small decisions that slowly led us to that night. For more than 30 years, I worked as a registered emergency room nurse in Charleston, South Carolina. I spent my adult life under fluorescent lights, surrounded by the sounds of monitors, stretchers, and hurried footsteps. I worked double shifts, weekends, holidays. I learned how to stay calm when everything around me was breaking apart. Nursing taught me discipline, responsibility, and the habit of putting others first, even when my body begged me to stop. It also taught me silence, the kind that comes from caring too much and never complaining about it. My husband, Thomas, was a dock maintenance supervisor. He was not a man of grand ambitions, but he was steady, kind, and deeply proud of providing for his family. When our son Ethan was 10 years old, Thomas died in an industrial accident at the port. One phone call changed everything. In a single moment, I went from being a wife and mother to being the only adult holding our small family together. There was no time to fall apart. Ethan needed stability, and stability became my job. Raising Ethan alone meant learning how to survive on little sleep and even less certainty. I took extra shifts whenever I could. I skipped meals without thinking about it. I sold my car and took the bus so he could stay in the same school. I did not see these things as sacrifices at the time. They were simply what needed to be done. I believed that if I worked hard enough, loved deeply enough, everything would eventually balance out. Ethan was a bright child, ambitious, focused. From an early age, he wanted more than what we had, and I encouraged that. I told him education mattered. I told him integrity mattered. I told him that how you treat people when no one is watching defines who you really are. I truly believed those lessons were taking root. When he was accepted into law school, I cried in my kitchen alone, overwhelmed by pride and relief. I thought my job was nearly finished. As Ethan built his career, I slowly faded into the background of his life. Phone calls became shorter. Visits became less frequent. He moved into a world of polished offices, private clubs, and conversations I was no longer part of. I did not resent him for that. I told myself this was the natural order of things. A mother steps back so her child can step forward. After Ethan left home, my life became very small and very quiet. I worked, I slept, I repeated the same routines. There was no bitterness in it, only absence. Then, 2 years ago, I met Samuel Brooks, a retired firefighter with tired eyes and an easy kindness. He had spent his life running toward danger so others could run away. We understood each other immediately. Loving him felt calm, not urgent. It felt earned. When Samuel asked me to marry him, I said yes because I wanted to live as more than just someone's past. I hoped Ethan would understand. I truly did. I did not yet realize how deeply my choice would challenge the image of the world he was trying to build. If you're still watching and you can feel the tension just beginning to surface, comment number 1 below so I know you're with me. What happened next was the first sign that this story would not end quietly. Now let's move on to chapter 2. The invitation arrived in the mail 2 weeks before the event, printed on thick ivory paper with Ethan's name embossed in gold. It was formal, carefully worded, and impersonal, as if sent by an assistant rather than a son. Still, when I held it in my hands, I felt something I had not felt in a long time: cautious hope. I told myself that perhaps this was Ethan's way of reopening a door he had quietly closed. I did not let myself get excited. I had learned over the years how dangerous expectations could be. On the evening of the celebration, I chose a simple navy dress I had worn many times before, pressed neatly and free of ornament. I wore the same low heels that never hurt my feet, and a small silver necklace Samuel had given me on our first anniversary. Samuel put on his only suit, dark gray and carefully cleaned, and stood in front of the mirror longer than usual, adjusting his tie with a seriousness that told me he wanted to do this right. Neither of us spoke much as we drove. There was an unspoken understanding that this night mattered more than we wanted to admit. The Charleston Heritage Country Club rose out of the darkness like something preserved behind glass. The driveway curved through perfectly trimmed hedges, lit by soft white lamps. Valet attendants moved efficiently, greeting guests by name. Laughter drifted from inside, accompanied by the faint sound of music. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest that came whenever I stepped into spaces built for people with more money, more confidence, more certainty than I had ever allowed myself to want. Still, I straightened my shoulders and walked forward. At the entrance, a uniformed security attendant took the invitation from my hand and scanned the list on his tablet. He paused longer than expected. His eyes flicked up, then back down, then to a second guard standing nearby. They exchanged a brief look, subtle but unmistakable. Finally, the man cleared his throat and handed the invitation back to me. He said there had been an update to the guest list. According to instructions from the host, we were not cleared to enter. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. Then I noticed the small sign mounted discreetly beside the door. The words were simple, printed in clean black letters. Guests must reflect the firm's image. I did not need anyone to explain what that meant. The realization settled over me slowly, like cold water. This was not a mistake. This was a choice Ethan had made. People continued to arrive behind us, stepping around as if we were part of the decor. I could feel eyes on my back, quick glances filled with curiosity or discomfort. Samuel shifted beside me, his body angled protectively, his jaw tight. He leaned close and asked if we should leave. His voice was calm, but I heard the hurt beneath it. I stood there a moment longer, long enough to understand that arguing would only confirm whatever judgment had already been made about us. I nodded and told Samuel we would go. Then I reached into my handbag and took out the small wooden box I had brought with me. It was plain, carefully crafted, light in weight, but solid in purpose. I handed it to the security attendant and asked him to deliver it to Ethan. I specified that it should be opened after the main speech, when everyone was gathered. The man hesitated, then agreed. He did not ask what was inside. As Samuel and I walked back toward the car, the sounds of the party faded behind us. I did not cry. I did not feel angry. Not yet. What I felt was clarity. Something essential had shifted, and I understood that whatever came next could no longer be avoided. If you're still here and starting to sense how deep this betrayal runs. Comment number 2 below. What unfolded next forced me to face a truth I had avoided for years. Let's continue to chapter 3. We sat in the car for a long moment after leaving the country club, neither of us reaching for the seatbelt right away. The glow from the building grew smaller in the rearview mirror as other cars passed us, carrying guests who had not been questioned, who belonged without explanation. The silence between Samuel and me was heavy, but it was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that settles when words would only distract from what has already been understood. Samuel finally started the engine and pulled onto the road. His hands were steady on the steering wheel, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. He did not raise his voice or curse. That was never his way. He said quietly that what Ethan had done was wrong, that no son should treat his mother that way, especially not in public. I listened without responding. I appreciated his anger on my behalf, but I did not share it. What I felt was something colder and more precise. I was not surprised. That realization came to me with unexpected clarity. Tonight had not changed my understanding of my son. It had confirmed it. Over the past few years, there had been small moments I had tried to excuse. Comments Ethan made about image and perception. The way he avoided mentioning my work when speaking to colleagues. The way he fell silent when I talked about my life. As if my past no longer fit into his present. Each moment on its own seemed harmless. Together, they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. As we drove, memories surfaced that I had pushed aside for too long. Ethan asking me not to attend certain events because they were professional. Ethan introducing me without mentioning that I was a nurse, as though my career were something to be embarrassed by. Ethan's discomfort when I chose to marry Samuel, not because he doubted Samuel's character, but because Samuel did not look like the kind of man who belonged in Ethan's world. I had told myself these were growing pains, signs of ambition. Now I understood they were choices. There was something else, something I had carried quietly for years. Knowledge that intersected with Ethan's professional life in a way I never intended. Long before tonight, long before the invitation or the sign at the door, I had recognized a familiar name connected to a legal case his firm was handling. A name tied to a medical emergency I had been part of years ago, a night I remembered clearly because of what followed. I had never told Ethan. I had never told anyone. I chose silence because I believed protecting my son was part of my duty as his mother. That silence came at a cost. Every time I saw Ethan speak proudly about ethics and responsibility, I felt it. Every time he rose higher, I felt it more. I told myself that what I knew was not my story to tell, that exposing it would only harm him. I convinced myself that love meant restraint. But sitting in that car, I realized how thin that justification had become. Ethan's rejection tonight was not emotional or impulsive. It was calculated. He had weighed my presence against his image and decided I did not belong. In that moment, my silence stopped being protection and started becoming participation. That truth settled heavily in my chest. Samuel did not ask me questions. He did not push me to explain what I was thinking. He simply drove, steady and patient, allowing me the space to come to my own conclusions. His presence reminded me of the values I thought I had passed on to my son. Honesty, accountability, respect for truth, even when it is inconvenient. As the road stretched out ahead of us, I understood that whatever came next could not be undone. The small wooden box I had handed over was no longer just a gesture. It was a line I had finally drawn. I did not want to punish my son. I wanted him to see himself clearly while there was still time to choose a different path. Once truth begins to move, it does not wait for permission to arrive. If you're still watching and wondering how far a mother can be pushed before she changes, comment number 3 to let me know. What I did next was not emotional, but it was irreversible. Now, Let's move on to Chapter 4. The days after the country club passed quietly, almost deceptively so. I woke each morning at the same hour, brewed my coffee, and watered the small plants by the kitchen window. Samuel went about his routines, fixing a loose hinge, reading the paper, giving me space without asking questions. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, everything felt sharpened, as if a long, dulled blade had finally been honed. I want to be clear about one thing. The wooden box I handed to security was not assembled in a moment of hurt or anger. It existed long before that night. What the party determined was timing, not intent. I had prepared it slowly, carefully, with the same discipline I once used to double-check medication dosages in the emergency room. There are things you do not rush when lives are involved. Years earlier, while working a late shift, I was assigned to a workplace accident that came in under urgent conditions. Multiple injuries, conflicting reports, and a company representative who arrived far too quickly with instructions that did not match what I was seeing. I documented everything precisely, because that was my duty. I noted inconsistencies between the injuries and the official account. I signed what I could ethically stand behind and refused what I could not. At the time, I believed the truth would surface without my intervention. Often, it does not. Time passed. Files were archived. I moved on. Then, much later, I saw a familiar company name attached to a legal brief linked to Ethan's firm. At first, I told myself it was coincidence. Companies grow, merge, rebrand. I wanted it to mean nothing. But the dates aligned too neatly. The language was too familiar. What I recognized was not proof of guilt, but proximity to a truth that had never been fully examined. I chose verification over assumption. Quietly, without involving Ethan, I consulted independent legal counsel. I asked questions the way I always had, precisely and without accusation. We reviewed timelines, documents, and ethical obligations. I confirmed what I could and set aside what I could not. Nothing went into the box unless it could withstand scrutiny. I refused to speculate. I refused to embellish. Truth does not need help to stand. Carrying that knowledge alone was heavier than I expected. There were nights I lay awake listening to Samuel breathe beside me, wondering how love becomes distorted when silence is mistaken for loyalty. I told myself that protecting my son meant waiting, that he would eventually choose differently, but waiting has a way of becoming permission if it goes on long enough. Samuel knew I was carrying something. He never asked directly. He brought me tea in the evenings and sat nearby while I organized papers at the kitchen table. His support was steady, unintrusive. He trusted my judgment without needing to control it. That trust mattered more than he knew. I drew a line for myself, quiet but firm. I would not expose anything to satisfy pride or pain. I would act only to prevent further harm and to give my son a chance to confront the truth while he still could. The difference between punishment and responsibility is intention, and mine was clear. By the time the invitation arrived, everything was verified. The box contained nothing but documented facts and a letter written with restraint. No accusations, no demands, just truth and time. I felt no triumph, no anticipation, only resolve. Some decisions feel heavy because they are right. When the moment came, I was ready, not because I wanted what followed, but because avoiding it had finally become the greater wrong. If you're still with me and you feel the pressure building, comment number 4 below. The next chapter is where everything comes into the open and nothing can be taken back. Let's continue. I was not at the country club when Ethan opened the box. That absence was intentional. I spent that evening at home, sitting at the small dining table with a cup of tea growing cold in front of me, aware of the schedule without watching the clock. I knew roughly when Ethan would speak, when the applause would rise, and when the gifts would be brought forward. Once the box left my hands, the outcome no longer depended on me. Waiting did not make me anxious. It felt like the quiet that follows a decision already made. Later, I learned how the evening unfolded. Ethan stood before a room full of colleagues, partners, and guests who had come to celebrate his success. He spoke with the confidence I remembered from his law school graduation, his voice steady and practiced. He talked about growth, responsibility, and the values that had guided his career. Those words, I was told, landed well. People nodded, glasses were raised. Nothing in his tone suggested hesitation or doubt. The gifts were presented one by one, expensive and elaborate, each met with polite admiration. Then the wooden box appeared, plain, small, out of place among polished metal and glossy wrapping. Someone mentioned that it was from me. Ethan smiled, the kind of tight smile that does not quite reach the eyes, and acknowledged it without comment. There was no hesitation when he opened it. At first, his expression showed only mild confusion, as though he had expected something sentimental and found something unexpected instead. That confusion did not last long. Those watching described a visible change in him, subtle but unmistakable. His posture stiffened. His hand paused mid-motion as he took in the contents. He did not read everything at once. He did not need to. Recognition came quickly, followed by something heavier. The room, which moments earlier had been filled with movement and sound, grew still. People sensed importance before understanding its cause. Silence has a way of spreading when truth enters a space unannounced. The documents did not accuse. They did not explain themselves. They simply existed, clear and orderly, offering facts without interpretation. Those who knew what they were looking at understood immediately. Those who did not waited, watching faces rather than pages. Ethan said nothing. His confidence, so carefully constructed, fractured under the weight of recognition. This was not a misunderstanding he could laugh away or redirect. It was a mirror held up without mercy or emotion. I was told that someone asked a quiet question, then another. Not confrontational, but precise. The kind of questions professionals ask when they realize a foundation may not be as solid as they believed. Ethan did not answer right away. He could not. Whatever image he had built for himself had been interrupted by something he could not control. I'm glad I was not there to see his face in that moment. I did not want my presence to turn the focus toward our relationship or my feelings. This was never meant to be a public reckoning between a mother and her son. It was meant to place Ethan alone with the consequences of his own choices. By staying away, I allowed the truth to stand on its own, unshielded by emotion. Once the box was opened, what followed belonged to others. Colleagues would discuss, partners would review, decisions would be made that I could neither influence nor soften. That was as it should be. Truth, once released, does not return to the person who carried it the longest. I did not feel satisfaction as the evening progressed. I felt certainty. Ethan had reached a moment where denial was no longer possible. What he chose to do next would define him far more than any success he had achieved before. My role in that moment was finished. Whatever happened afterward would no longer be mine to shape, only his to face. The hours after the party passed without ceremony. I did not receive immediate news, only fragments that reached me slowly, filtered through distance and discretion. Someone had ended the celebration early. Conversations had shifted behind closed doors. Schedules were suddenly rearranged, nothing loud or dramatic, just the unmistakable sound of momentum changing direction. I stayed where I was, at home, aware that events were moving forward without my presence or permission. Inside the wooden box, beneath the documents, I had placed a letter written by hand. I remembered choosing each word carefully, not to soften the truth but to keep it clean. I told Ethan that the materials were verified and complete. I told him I had not shared them with anyone else, and I told him that he had 24 hours to decide what came next. He could disclose the information himself to the appropriate parties, or I would do it for him when that time expired. There was no threat in the letter, no anger, just a boundary. I did not give him that time out of kindness alone. I gave it because choice matters. I had protected Ethan for years by staying silent, and I would not replace that silence with control. If he was going to face consequences, they would come from his own decision, not my hand forcing it. Responsibility only means something when it is chosen. Samuel asked me quietly, later that evening, whether Ethan had called. I shook my head. He did not press. He poured tea, sat across from me, and let the clock continue its steady work. His calm grounded me. There is a difference between standing beside someone and steering them. Samuel understood that difference instinctively. Ethan called just before midnight. I recognized the number immediately. His voice, when I answered, was steady but stripped of its usual confidence. He did not raise his voice or accuse me of betrayal. Instead, he asked measured questions. He wanted to know how long I had known. He wanted to know whether anyone else had copies. He wanted to know what would happen if he cooperated. I answered only what was necessary. I did not argue or justify myself. I did not explain my pain. The conversation was brief. There were no apologies and no forgiveness offered. Neither of us reached for comfort. When we ended the call, I understood that this was not a moment of reconciliation. It was a moment of reckoning. Whatever he decided, the version of our relationship that existed before that night was already gone. Waiting is a strange discipline. The house seemed louder than usual, every sound sharpened by anticipation. The refrigerator hummed, the clock ticking in the hallway, Samuel moving quietly from room to room. I slept little. I did not pace or check my phone. I had done everything I could do without crossing the line I had set for myself. By morning, I felt neither dread nor hope. I felt prepared. Prepared to lose access to my son if that was the cost. Prepared to accept his anger if he chose denial. Prepared, too, for the possibility that he might finally step forward on his own. Letting go of control does not lessen the weight of the outcome, but it does clarify where responsibility lies. I knew that whatever Ethan chose would define more than his career. It would define who he was willing to be when his image no longer protected him. That realization was sobering, but it was also honest. This was no longer about embarrassment or family conflict. It was about character, exposed under pressure. As the 24-hour window narrowed, I felt a quiet certainty settle in me. I had acted not as an enemy, but as a witness who refused to look away. Whatever came next would not be my victory or my failure. It would be his answer to the truth he had been given. If you're still watching and wondering whether truth really leads to consequences, comment number 6, so I know you're here. What happened next changed my son's life forever. Now, let's move on to chapter 7. I learned of Ethan's decision the next morning, not from him directly, but through the quiet confirmation that moves through professional circles long before it reaches family. He had acted within the time I gave him. He reported the matter himself, formally and without spectacle. There were no statements, no public confessions, no attempt to control the story. He stepped back from his role and placed himself under review. The choice was his, and because of that, it carried weight. The immediate fallout was swift and contained. His pending promotion was suspended. His caseload was reassigned. Meetings were canceled without explanation. Colleagues who once sought his approval now kept a careful distance, not out of cruelty but caution. In that world, Restraint speaks louder than outrage. There was no scandal splashed across headlines, only a quiet recalibration of trust. I understood then how reputations can erode without a single public word being spoken. Ethan came by the house later that week. He looked smaller to me, not physically diminished, but stripped of the ease he once carried. He did not bring defenses with him. He did not argue. He told me what had happened in the measured terms, as if reporting facts rather than sharing fear. He said the review would take time. He said he did not know what the outcome would be. I listened. I did not reassure him. Consequences lose meaning when softened too quickly. Claire's response unfolded more slowly. She began asking questions Ethan could not redirect or minimize. Questions about timing, about choices, about what he valued when no one was watching. The engagement was not ended, but it was no longer certain. Distance entered their conversations, the kind that forces people to reconsider what they thought they knew. I felt no satisfaction in that uncertainty. I felt only the dull ache that comes from watching foundations crack. It was during this period that Samuel told me something he had never mentioned before. Years earlier, he had responded to a house fire on the outskirts of town. A man had been trapped upstairs, disoriented and slow to move. Samuel carried him out himself. That man, it turned out, was Claire's father. The family remembered the firefighter who stayed calm when everything else was burning. When they learned who Samuel was, their tone changed. They looked at him not as an inconvenience, but as a man whose integrity had already been tested under pressure. That contrast did not go unnoticed by Ethan. He saw, perhaps for the first time, how character reveals itself without performance. There was no resentment in his expression when he spoke of it, only recognition. He was beginning to understand the cost of choosing image over substance. As for me, I did not feel vindicated. I felt grief for the son I thought I had raised, and relief that I had finally stopped carrying a truth that was not mine alone to bear. Loss and clarity can exist at the same time. One does not cancel the other. The power dynamics between us had shifted. Ethan no longer filled the space with explanations or ambition. He listened more than he spoke. That silence was uncomfortable for him, but necessary. Listening is often the first consequence of losing control. I knew these consequences were not the end of his story. They were the beginning of something slower and more difficult, rebuilding trust without shortcuts. Whether Ethan would accept that work remained to be seen. What mattered to me was that the truth had taken its proper place, no longer hidden or protected. Consequences are not punishment. They are the natural shape of decisions once they are allowed to stand. As I watched the days settle into a new rhythm, I understood that what followed would not be quick or easy, but it would be honest. And honesty, at this stage, was enough to keep moving forward. After the first wave of consequences passed, life slowed in a way that felt unfamiliar. There were no more urgent phone calls, no sudden updates that made my chest tighten. Days returned to their ordinary shape, but the ordinary no longer felt the same. Emotional exhaustion settled in quietly, the kind that follows long tension rather than dramatic release. I woke up tired, even after a full night of sleep, as if my body was still adjusting to the absence of constant vigilance. Ethan remained under professional review. There were no clear timelines, no guarantees. He did not speculate about outcomes when we spoke, and I did not ask. Uncertainty became part of the air around us, something we both breathed without comment. I realized then that consequences are rarely neat or contained. They linger. They stretch time. They require endurance rather than reaction. Inside myself, I tried to understand what I was feeling. Relief was there, undeniable. The truth was no longer hidden, no longer pressing against my ribs at night. But relief did not erase sadness. I grieved for the version of our relationship that could not be recovered, the easy closeness I once believed would return if I waited long enough. Justice and peace, I learned, are not the same thing. One can arrive without bringing the other fully along. Ethan began reaching out more consistently, but differently than before. He no longer spoke at length about his plans or explained himself preemptively. Instead, he asked simple questions. He listened. When silence fell between us, he did not rush to fill it. That change mattered more than any apology he might have offered too soon. It suggested he was beginning to see beyond performance. One afternoon, he stopped by briefly. We sat at the kitchen table, the same place where I had once organized documents late into the night. Our conversation was restrained, almost formal. He spoke about practical matters, about the review process, about taking responsibility for the outcomes. There were no emotional declarations, no attempts to rewrite the past. When he left, he thanked me for my time. It was a small gesture, but it carried weight. Samuel remained steady throughout it all. He did not change his tone or his routines. He did not offer opinions unless asked. His consistency was grounding. Watching him move through the days with the same quiet integrity reminded me that character is not shaped by crisis alone, but revealed by how one lives when no one is watching. That example was there for Ethan to observe, whether he chose to or not. I began to rethink what motherhood meant at this stage of life. For years, I believed protecting my child meant absorbing discomfort so he would not have to face it. Letting consequences stand felt at times like a failure of care. Slowly, I understood it differently. Allowing him to meet the full weight of his decisions was not abandonment. It was respect. It acknowledged his capacity to choose, to learn, to change without being shielded from reality. I saw signs of accountability in him, subtle and unannounced. He stopped blaming circumstances. He did not frame himself as unlucky. He accepted limits without argument. These were small shifts, easily missed, but I noticed them because I had learned how to watch closely. I also accepted that reconciliation, if it came, would look different than what I once imagined. We might never return to the warmth we lost. What we could build instead would have to be honest, slower, and bounded by clearer lines. As the weeks passed, I settled into patience rather than expectation. I stopped waiting for a moment that would signal everything was repaired. Some things are not repaired, they are lived with. Understanding that allowed me to breathe more freely and move forward without forcing an ending that did not yet exist. If you've stayed this far and you're ready to see how everything finally settles, comment number 8 below. The ending is quiet, but it carries a lesson that stays with you. Let's move on to the conclusion. Several months passed after the review concluded, enough time for the sharp edges of the crisis to soften into something quieter and more stable. Life found a new rhythm, not the one I once imagined, but one that no longer required constant adjustment or emotional vigilance. The house felt lighter. My thoughts felt less crowded. What remained was clarity, not comfort, but clarity was enough. Ethan's professional outcome arrived without ceremony. He kept his license and his position at the firm, but his advancement stopped completely. The promotion he had worked toward for years was withdrawn. He was reassigned to a different division under strict ethical oversight, with limitations that would follow him for the foreseeable future. It was not the end of his career, but it was the end of his momentum. When he told me, his voice held no anger. He described it plainly, as a fact rather than an injustice. What surprised me most was his acceptance. He did not argue that the decision was unfair. He did not blame timing or circumstance. He said only that he understood why it happened and that he intended to live with it. That quiet acknowledgement mattered more than any defense he might have offered. It told me that something essential had shifted inside him. Our relationship settled into a new shape, We spoke less often, but with more intention. There were no assumptions about closeness or obligation. Boundaries existed where there had once been expectation. When we spent time together, it was deliberate, measured, and honest. We did not pretend to return to what we had been. We allowed ourselves to build something smaller and steadier instead. One afternoon, Ethan came by unannounced. Samuel was in the yard repairing a section of fence. Without hesitation, Ethan stepped outside and asked if he could help. They worked side by side for an hour, exchanging only practical words. When they finished, Ethan thanked him directly, not out of politeness, but respect. It was the first time I had seen my son acknowledge Samuel without discomfort. That moment, quiet and ordinary, carried more meaning than any apology. Inside myself, something finally settled. I no longer felt guilt for the choice I had made. I carried sadness for what was lost, but it no longer weighed on me. The burden I had held for years, the responsibility for shielding my son from consequences, was gone. In its place was a calm understanding that love does not require protection from truth. Sometimes it requires allowing truth to do its work. I began to see justice differently, not as punishment or exposure, but as alignment. When actions and consequences finally meet, balance is restored. Nothing is erased, but nothing remains hidden either. That balance brought a sense of peace I had not expected. Life continued in quieter ways. Samuel and I planned small trips. I returned to old hobbies I had neglected. I no longer measured my days by Ethan's success or approval. His choices were his own now, fully and finally. This was not a perfect ending. There were no sweeping reconciliations or declarations, but it was honest. And honesty, after everything we had endured, felt like the most complete resolution we could have reached. For a long time, I believed that being a mother meant enduring quietly. I thought love was measured by how much pain I could absorb without protest, how much disrespect I could excuse in the name of sacrifice. That belief shaped most of my adult life. Letting it go was not sudden or dramatic. It happened slowly, the way old habits loosen when they no longer fit who you have become. What happened with Ethan forced me to confront the line between love and indulgence. I had crossed that line for years without noticing. I told myself I was protecting him, when in reality I was shielding him from consequences that belonged to him alone. Silence felt safer than conflict, but safety came at the cost of my own dignity. I understand now that silence, when it enables harm, is not kindness. It is fear disguised as loyalty. I learned that dignity is not something granted by children, spouses, or society. It is something you claim for yourself. Being a mother does not mean accepting humiliation or erasing your values to keep peace. Love that demands self-neglect eventually turns into resentment, even if it wears a gentle face. Choosing truth over comfort was painful, but it was also clarifying. It showed me who I was when I stopped shrinking. My relationship with Ethan will never return to what it once was, and I no longer expect it to. What exists now is quieter and more honest. There are boundaries where there were once assumptions. There is respect where there was once performance. His journey is still unfolding, and I do not control where it leads. Letting go of that control was its own kind of freedom. Samuel's presence reminds me daily that integrity does not need attention to be real. Our life together is simple and unremarkable from the outside, but it is built on consistency and truth. There is no spectacle here, only steadiness. I have learned to value that more than admiration. Justice, as I see it now, is not about exposure or punishment. It is about alignment. When actions meet their consequences, balance is restored. Nothing is erased, but nothing remains hidden. That balance brought peace, not because it fixed everything, but because it allowed me to stop carrying what was never mine to hold alone. To anyone who has been made to feel small by those they once sacrificed everything for, know this: reclaiming your dignity is not betrayal. It is survival. Sometimes the most loving act is the one that feels hardest, the one that risks misunderstanding so that truth can finally exist. I no longer measure my life by my son's success or failure. I measure it by the peace I carry and the values I refuse to abandon. That peace did not come easily, but it came honestly. And in the end, honesty became the gift that changed everything, including me. Some stories do not end with victory or defeat, but with understanding. They remind us that truth, when faced honestly, reshapes lives in quiet but lasting ways. Growth is rarely loud. It comes through accountability, through boundaries, through the courage to stop carrying what was never meant to be ours alone. Love, at its strongest, does not erase consequences. It allows them to teach. And our dignity, once reclaimed, becomes a steady ground from which peace can finally grow. If this story resonated with you, you are not alone. Many people carry similar wounds, questions, and hard-earned lessons. Thank you for spending your time here and reflecting on this journey. If you have thoughts or experiences you would like to share, feel free to leave a comment below. Your voice matters. And if you would like to hear more stories like this, please follow and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep these conversations alive.